Welcome back. On your Do Now, you were thinking about the Berlin Wall and its impact on Germany. So, hopefully, you wrote something to the effect of the Berlin Wall divided the city and divided the country. People lost their jobs, they were separated from families. It led to conflict. It led to the death of hundreds of people who tried to cross the wall. And ultimately, the Berlin Wall became the symbol of the Cold War, this division between capitalist in the West, like America, and communist in the East, like the Soviet Union, and how our world was divided, and that we were killing each other over it, and stopping division, and stopping people from living their lives and crossing borders. And it just sort of represents that whole idea of the Cold War, that it was this big threat, this potential World War III that could have happened. It almost happened at the almost happened at the Berlin Wall several times. So just a reminder of kind of how the world's cut up during this Cold War. The United States is in blue, all our allies in light blue, Soviet Union's in red, its allies are in red and orange. Here's Berlin, Germany divided. There's a lot of conflict, potential war there. Today we're going to go to what looks like a complete outlier, right? It looks like, you know, communism is basically in Eastern Europe and Asia, and then the Western Hemisphere is all capitalist, like the United States, except for this. There's an island right here that seems to be orange, which would make it a Soviet ally. This is Cuba. Today we're going to talk about Cuba and how it became communist and its conflicts with the United States. So here's a zoomed in version of where Cuba is, right off the coast of Florida. At its shortest, it's like 90 miles away. It's really close. And we're going to talk about some of the events. They're mostly within the 1960s. It's going to be our next major hotspot. So let me go back. Cuba, for a long time, was an American ally. We helped Cuba gain its independence against Spain years before, decades before, and it was a close ally. We did a lot of business and trade. Americans would go down there on vacation, a lot of resorts and gambling and stuff like that. And it was this sort of vacation resort place that Americans used. That all changes in the late 50s, early 60s. Fidel Castro and other communists overthrow the government, conquer the island, and turn it into a communist country. And this is sort of a shock to the United States. We didn't think communists could happen this close to us, nor by a country that we assumed was our ally. Right? And Cuba immediately allies with the Soviet Union. So now they're not only did they like throw off the government that was allies to us, they went to our worst enemy. Now friends with our worst enemy. Now communism is 90 miles away from America. Remember, the U.S. was worried about that domino theory, that if one country falls, so does its neighbors, and eventually all these dominoes fall. There's no stopping it. And we were worried that like North Korea would lead to South Korea, to Japan, to Taiwan, to Australia, New Zealand. Eventually the United States would fall too. When Cuba became communist, it's almost like you cut that domino line. Instead of knocking down the first domino, you jumped like 30 ahead and knocked down one right next to the United States. Right? Now it feels like if the domino theory is real, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, all these countries turn communist. How soon until the United States does? Right? So it really sort of fast forwarded a lot of that domino theory. There's real fears that communism is going to try and invade the United States through Cuba. There's a bigger problem. Let me go back. Cuba is right next to the United States. Cuba, if they were to launch an attack, would be bad. But what if they just launched missiles? They could hit the United States. One of the reasons why the US and the Soviet Union never actually launched weapons is that if the US were to launch nukes at the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union would launch them back, it would take hours and hours for that missile to get all the way to the United States before it exploded. That means the United States would know it's coming. Now, we couldn't shoot it down. We didn't have the technology to do that yet. But as that nuke is coming to us, we'd start firing our own nukes back. So whoever launches the first nuke knows they're getting some in return. The fear is that if Cuba has nukes on it, it could wipe out the United States before we even know what's happening. We wouldn't have time to react. If the Soviet Union gets nukes on Cuba, they win the Cold War. they could launch nukes at the U.S. at any moment. There's nothing we can do in response. So pretty scary. Now, the U.S. is going to have two major events with Cuba in the 1960s. They're both with Kennedy as president. The first one's called the Bay of Pigs. Now, there's a place in Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. The U.S. didn't want to invade Cuba and conquer it, right? That would have sparked World War III. But if the Cuban people were to rise up and fight back, start another civil war, and maybe win that way, maybe that would work. So the U.S. is going to launch a bunch of CIA operatives in this place called the Bay of Pigs, and they're supposed to rile up the Cuban people to go fight a war against their government. And it's a complete disaster. The people who land aren't given enough supplies. They start stealing from the Cuban people. They very quickly get arrested and captured, and it's this complete disaster. It makes Kennedy look awful. It makes the United States look awful. It's a huge embarrassment. And this happens right after Kennedy becomes president. And it's his biggest failure. Good news is, and bad news for the world, is he gets another chance because there's something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what happens here is that the U.S. finds out that the Soviet Union is shipping nukes to Cuba. They see the ships, they know what's on them, that they're trying to set up nuclear silos in Cuba that can launch against the United States. Now, the U.S. can't have this. We can't have nukes in Cuba. But if we sink those ships, we're starting World War III. So what Kennedy decides to do is he does a blockade. He essentially blocks off this area of the ocean and prevents any ships from crossing. U.S. naval ships are going to patrol this ocean back and forth and not let anything through. And the Soviet ships are going to show up, and they're going to patrol this area, and they're going to think about trying to cross. And it's like a week of these ships crossing each other back and forth. At any moment, either one of these could start launching weapons. You could start launching nukes. This was about as close as you get to World War III. This is like seconds, minutes away from actually deploying nukes at each other. U.S. and Soviet military pointing right at each other in the same water, ready to go to war. While this is happening, Kennedy's behind the scenes trying to negotiate and calm things down. Eventually, they agree to remove the nukes from Cuba. The Soviet ships go home, and the U.S. pulls some of their nukes out of Europe and sort of calms everything down. And this goes down as a big success for Kennedy because he averts World War III. He stops this from happening. We got a couple of videos we're going to watch about this. You can pause this video while we watch those. So everything calms down after the missile crisis, but we still have this problem. We still have a communist country. Our former friend is now our enemy. We can't just let that happen. So America is going to put what we call an embargo on Cuba. We're going to refuse to do business with them. We're not going to buy any of their stuff. We're not going to sell them any of our stuff. We're not going to interact with them. This is going to be a big deal to Cuba, right? With the United States right next to it, that's where they got most of their money, was doing business with the United States. So to be cut off is going to doom them to poverty. They're going to be stuck in poverty for decades. So in recent years, both Obama and Trump have done things to sort of lift this embargo a little bit. To lift an embargo means to allow more trade and business. So you can technically travel to Cuba now. You can buy small quantities of stuff, but businesses are not allowed to interact, right? So you can't buy sugar from Cuba as a company. You can't buy their watermelons, their product, whatever they're producing, you can't buy it. But you as an average person could go to Cuba and buy those things. So Cuba's still stuck in absolute poverty. We still don't do much business with them, but we sort of lifted it a little bit. So the question is, like, the Cold War is over. The U.S. is okay friends with Russia up until very recently. We work with China. We work with Vietnam. We work a little bit, with some of these other communist countries. Why not Cuba? Why are we holding on to this Cold War punishment? Why can't we let it go? Here's Fidel Castro. He was the dictator of Cuba for a long time. America hated him, tried multiple times to assassinate him, and failed every time. But he passed away like a decade ago. His brother, Raul, is technically in charge right now, although he's pretty old too. He doesn't do a whole lot. This is the guy who's really in charge. This is Miguel Diaz. Um, so the question is, like, should America be working with this guy to negotiate some sort of peace and end this embargo? So your activity today is going to be reading about the embargo, arguments for and against it. Your goal is to summarize the arguments. Why should we lift it? Why should we not? When done, you can do some makeup work, maybe finish up that test from last week.